Section 25 of Further Chronicles of Avonlea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Further Chronicles of Avonlea by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 13. The Conscience Case of David Bell, Part 1. Eben Bell came in with an armful of wood and banged it cheerfully down in the box behind the glowing Waterloo stove, which was coloring the heart of the little kitchen's gloom with tremulous, rose-red whirls of light. "There, sis, that's the last chore on my list. Bob's milking, nothing more for me to do but put on my white collar for meeting. Avonlea is more lively since the evangelist came, ain't it, though?" Molly Bell nodded. She was curling her hair before the tiny mirror that hung on the whitewashed wall and distorted her round, pink and white face into a grotesque caricature. "Wonder who'll stand up tonight," said Eben reflectively, sitting down on the edge of the woodbox. "There ain't many sinners left in Avonlea, only a few hardened chaps like myself." "You shouldn't talk like that," said Molly rebukingly. "What if Father heard you?" "Father wouldn't hear me if I shouted it in his ear," returned Eben. "He goes around these days like a man in a dream, and a mighty bad dream at that. Father has always been a good man. What's the matter with him?" "I don't know," said Molly, dropping her voice. "Mother is dreadfully worried over him. And everybody is talking, Eb. It just makes me squirm. Flora Jane Fletcher asked me last night why Father never testified, and him one of the elders. She said the minister was perplexed about it. I felt my face getting red." "Why didn't you tell her it was no business of hers?" said Eben angrily. "Old Flora Jane had better mind her own business." "But all the folks are talking about it, Eb, and Mother is fretting her heart out over it. Father has never acted like himself since these meetings began. He just goes there night after night and sits like a mummy with his head down. And almost everybody else in Avonlea has testified." "Oh, no, there's lots haven't," said Eben. "Matthew Cuthbert never has, nor Uncle Elisha, nor any of the Whites. But everybody knows they don't believe in getting up and testifying, so nobody wonders when they don't. Besides," Molly laughed, "Matthew could never get a word out in public if he did believe in it. He'd be too shy. But," she added with a sigh, "it isn't that way with Father. He believes in testimony, so people wonder why he doesn't get up. Why, even old Josiah Sloane gets up every night." "With his whiskers sticking out every which way, and his hair ditto," interjected the graceless Eben. "When the minister calls for testimonials, and all the folks look at our pew, I feel ready to sink through the floor for shame," sighed Molly. "If Father would get up just once!" Miriam Bell entered the kitchen. She was ready for the meeting, to which Major Spencer was to take her. She was a tall, pale girl with a serious face, and dark, thoughtful eyes, totally unlike Molly. She had come under conviction during the meetings, and had stood up for prayer and testimony several times. The evangelist thought her very spiritual. She heard Molly's concluding sentence and spoke reprovingly. "You shouldn't criticize your father, Molly. It isn't for you to judge him." Eben had hastily slipped out. He was afraid Miriam would begin talking religion to him if he stayed. He had with difficulty escaped from an exhortation by Robert in the cow-stable. There was no peace in Avonlea for the unregenerate, he reflected. Robert and Miriam had both come out, and Molly was hovering on the brink. "Dad and I are the black sheep of the family," he said with a laugh, for which he at once felt guilty. Eben had been brought up with a strict reverence for all religious matters. On the surface he might sometimes laugh at them, but the deeps troubled him whenever he did so. Indoors, Miriam touched her younger sister's shoulder and looked at her affectionately. "Won't you decide tonight, Molly?" she asked in a voice tremulous with emotion. Molly crimsoned and turned her face away uncomfortably. She did not know what answer to make, and was glad that a jingle of bells outside saved her the necessity of replying. "There's your bow, Miriam," she said as she dashed into the sitting-room. Soon after, Eben brought the family pung and his chubby red mare to the door for Molly. He had not as yet attained to the dignity of a cutter of his own. That was for his elder brother Robert, who presently came out in his new fur coat and drove dashingly away with bells and glitter. "Thinks he's the people," remarked Eben with a fraternal grin. The rich winter twilight was purpling over the white world as they drove down the lane under the overarching wild cherries that glittered with gemmy hoarfrost. The snow creaked and crisped under the runners. A shrill wind was keening in the leafless dogwoods. Over the trees the sky was a dome of silver, with a lucent star or two on the slope of the west. Earth stars gleamed warmly out here and there, where homesteads were tucked snugly away in their orchards or groves of birch. "The church will be jammed tonight," said Eben. "It's so fine that folks will come from far and near. Guess it'll be exciting." "If only Father would testify," sighed Molly from the bottom of the pung, where she was snuggled amid furs and straw. "Miriam can say what she likes, but I do feels as if we were all disgraced. It sends a creep all over me to hear Mr. Bentley say, 'Now, isn't there one more to say a word for Jesus?' and look right over at Father." Eben flicked his mare with his whip, and she broke into a trot. The silence was filled with a faint, fairy-like medley from far down the road where a pungful of young folks from White Sands were singing hymns on their way to meeting. "Look here, Molly," said Eben awkwardly at last, "are you going to stand up for prayers tonight?" I can't as long as Father acts this way," answered Molly in a choked voice. I want to, Eb, and Mary and Bob want me to, but I can't. I do hope that the evangelist won't come and talk to me special tonight. I always feels as if I was being pulled in two different ways when he does." Back in the kitchen at home, Mrs. Bell was waiting for her husband to bring the horse to the door. She was a slight, dark-eyed little woman with thin, vivid red cheeks. From out of the swathings in which she had wrapped her bonnet, her face gleamed, sad and troubled. Now and then she sighed heavily. The cat came to her from under the stove, languidly stretching himself, and yawning until all the red cavern of his mouth and throat was revealed. At the moment he had an uncanny resemblance to Elder Joseph Blewett of White Sands, Roaring Joe, the irreverent boys called him, when he grew excited and shouted. Mrs. Bell saw it, and then reproached herself for the sacrilege. "But it's no wonder I've wicked thoughts," she said wearily. "I'm that worried I ain't rightly myself. If he would only tell me what the trouble is, maybe I could help him. At any rate, I'd know. It hurts me so to see him going about, day after day, with his head hanging and that look on his face, as if he had something fearful on his conscience, him that never harmed a living soul. And then the way he groans and mutters in his sleep. He has always lived a just, upright life. He hasn't no right to go on like this, disgracing his family." Mrs. Bell's angry sob was cut short by the sleigh at the door. Her husband poked in his busy, iron-gray head and said, "Now, Mother." He helped her into the sleigh, tucked the rugs warmly around her, and put a hot brick at her feet. His solicitude hurt her. It was all for her material comfort. It did not matter to him what mental agony she must suffer over his strange attitude. For the first time in their married life, Mary Bell felt resentment against her husband. They drove along in silence, past the snow-powdered hedges of spruce, and under the arches of the forest roadways. They were late, and a great stillness was over all the land. David Bell never spoke. All his usual cheerful talkativeness had disappeared since the revival meetings had begun in Avonlea. From the first he had gone about as a man over whom some strange doom is impending, seemingly oblivious to all that might be said or thought of him in his own family or in the church. Mary Bell thought she would go out of her mind if her husband continued to act in this way. Her reflections were bitter and rebellious as they sped along through the glittering night of the winter's prime. "I don't get one bit of good out of the meetings," she thought resentfully. "There ain't any peace or joy for me, not even in testifying myself, when David sits there like a stick or stone. If he'd been opposed to the revivalist coming here, like old Uncle Jerry, or if he didn't believe in public testimony, I wouldn't mind. I'd understand. But as it is, I feel dreadful humiliated." Revival meetings had never been held in Avonlea before. Uncle Jerry McPherson, who was the supreme local authority in church matters, taking precedence of even the minister, had been uncompromisingly opposed to them. He was a stern, deeply religious Scotsman, with a horror of the emotional form of religion. As long as Uncle Jerry's spare, ascetic form and deeply graved, square-jawed face filled his accustomed corner by the northwest corner of Avonlea Church, no revivalist might venture therein, although the majority of the congregation, including the minister, would have welcomed one warmly. But now Uncle Jerry was sleeping peacefully under the tangled grasses and white snows of the burying-ground, and if dead people ever do turn in their graves, Uncle Jerry might well have turned in his when the revivalists came to Avonlea Church, and there followed the emotional services, public testimonies, and religious excitement which the old man's sturdy soul had always abhorred. Avonlea was a good field for an evangelist. The Reverend Geoffrey Mountain, who came to assist the Avonlea minister in revivifying the dry bones thereof, knew this and revelled in the knowledge. It was not often that such a virgin parish could be found nowadays, with scores of impressionable, unspoiled souls on which fervid oratory could play skilfully, as a master on a mighty organ, until every note in them thrilled to life and utterance. The Reverend Geoffrey Mountain was a good man, of the earth, earthy to be sure, but with an unquestionable sincerity of belief and purpose which went far to counterbalance the sensationalism of some of his methods. He was large and handsome, with a marvellously sweet and winning voice, a voice that could melt into irresistible tenderness, or swell into sonorous appeal and condemnation, or ring like a trumpet calling to battle. His frequent grammatical errors and lapses into vulgarity counted for nothing against its charm, and the most commonplace words in the world could have borrowed much of the power of real oratory from its magic. He knew its value and used it effectively, perhaps even ostentatiously. Geoffrey Mountain's religion and methods, like the man himself, were showy, but of their kind, sincere, and, though the good he accomplished might not be unmixed, it was a quantity to be reckoned with. End of section 25.